Technology is fast disrupting business on a global scale, and South Africa is no exception. So how do our businesses evolve? Joining me with more is Gareth Rees, who is the Head of Global Partnerships at IoT.nxt. Gareth, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you. Good to speak to you.
Gareth, you travel quite extensively, evaluating different technologies in use around the world, visiting innovation labs. How do you feel South Africa compares with what's happening on a global scale?
I think there's a tendency to think that South Africa is quite far behind. I don't necessarily share that sentiment. I believe that South Africa, specifically in terms of some of the young, innovative companies that are growing up in South Africa and actually on the continent in general, they're solving for problems that the West don't know they have yet. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is it's resulting in quite a lot of reverse innovation where we're solving for these very real problems in South Africa, and then they translate incredibly well into more developed economies. So to give you an example, IoT.nxt in particular had to solve in the industrial IoT space how we deal with expensive data and very slow connectivity. Because when you go and you're in Silicon Valley, I can send as much data into the cloud as I want, and I can use machine learning to come up with clever predictive models and really nice graphics and all those things. When I'm in Rustenburg on a 2G edge network, those things aren't possible. So we were forced to think about how do we manage more of the information on the edge itself, so actually in the operational environment, but still have the ability to leverage the power of these large platforms. So to answer your question directly, I think there are a lot of young companies that have solved for frictions in the developing market space that are now becoming large issues in the West. Even simple things like, again, in IoT, most companies were looking at the sensor to cloud approach, where I have this information from sensors, I'm going to send it into the cloud, and then from there I'm going to make it work. Now we're seeing the huge risks in cybersecurity with having all these separate devices that don't have protection on them plugging into a network of a naval ship or a nuclear power station. So now we're saying, how do we go and actually bring more of the security down to the edge? And we ended up solving for that because of the problems that we had in Africa, not necessarily because of abundance of technology. So I think that South Africa is creating some incredible IP, and a lot of our corporates are engaging with those companies. But it is still relatively early days. I think South African corporates are conservative. Mm-hmm. They tend to work with larger, more established technology companies. But I'm seeing a lot of movement now and programs from these companies to very actively engage with these technologies to create business value.
Now, it's interesting that you mentioned or that you made the distinction between young emerging companies that are coming up with this innovative technology, these ideas and IP, and corporates kind of in the background being more conservative. Mm-hmm. Why? Why aren't corporates responding yet?
The person who developed the first electric light bulb was not the guy who made candles. He didn't try to make a better way of making light by creating a light bulb. He tried to make a better candle. So the problem that we have with corporates is they've been very successful in what they've been doing in the past. So they have the tendency to try and just do it better and more efficient. And then we have this focus on cost cutting and efficiencies. And what ends up happening is you end up stripping out the innovation and just driving cost optimization. But what happens is those linear business models get intersected by technology. And that technology is usually coming from companies that can't compete with the large organizations because they don't have the scale. Mm-hmm. So they need to leverage these technologies to compete. But then as soon as they get to an equal playing field, the corporates can't keep up anymore because they're going linear and these guys have exponential business models. What then usually happens is large amounts of partnering and often acquisitions, where a large company might now go and buy a younger company, but even in that domain, there's a huge amount of risk because you might go and buy this company, bring it into your bureaucratic organization and kill what makes it special. So the question is, how do you go and, as a corporate, you can't be as flexible and as agile as a young company. It's not possible. There's too much entropy in your system, right? So You have to figure out agile governance structures that allow you to play with best-of-breed technology players, but without stifling their innovation. And I think that corporates are getting better at it, but ultimately their dominant logic is to persist their core business model.
So it's this agility that's going to be the key to corporates remaining relevant.
I think so. And maybe to unpack what you mean by agility is we need to recognize that we can't always take the whole organization into the future, right? So in our core telco business or our core banking business, you need the core of that business to just be a better bank and to be a better telco. And they must do that, okay? But the growth, the new value will come in the ecosystems that you build around that core. And what's very, very important is to make sure that you govern those adjacencies differently. Because if I'm trying to manage this on my, 3 times annual feedback session to the board, you'll never be able to manage it. In our world, in IoT.nxt at the moment, in a week, in 2 weeks, so much can happen. Our clock speed is just so much faster. We're engaging with more people, more customers. In a corporate, you can go and have a meeting on Monday and not think about it again until next week, Tuesday. And that's quite common. A week in a corporate is nothing. A week in a young company, a whole world can change in a week. What I'm trying to say is don't knock the corporate. They can't be as agile as a young company because they've got risk and they've got brand and they've got governance and they've got all kinds of things that they need to look after. So let them be a corporate. For me, it's very exciting to see someone like Stuart van der Veen from Nedbank having this disruptive mandate inside the bank. I mean, banks are not necessarily known for being particularly disruptive. They invest in disruptive companies. But what they're actually doing there is putting on balance sheet money into creating new value propositions for customers outside of core banking, which is really, really exciting. It doesn't stop them from being a bank that has covenants and governance and structure because it needs those things. But now you can also still have your cake and eat it to an extent.
You also mentioned, though, that banks need to govern some of these structures that they're creating outside their core structure differently. In an environment as heavily regulated as banking, and with good reason, how do they actually navigate this?
That's a very good question. And I think things like, the blockchain the regulations are going to be emerging. In many cases, only once the business model actually disrupts the market will the regulation come. And I'm sorry to mention Uber because that's like a no-no to say in Uber these days. But if you look at what happened with Uber, they were successful, but in France they were shut down. But here they were, hugely successful. And that is an interesting dynamic that will continue to play out. And we look at things like the blockchain. That will now be regulated in Russia and regulated in China like a currency. So how much of the benefit of the technology will actually accrue into the market will be dependent on how regulation manages this. Another one is drones. So right now, I appreciate that you don't want to have just drones flying around in the street, because firstly, if it crashes, it's probably going to kill me because it weighs 20 kilograms. And secondly, I don't want you flying into my garden and affecting my personal space. But do I see the value of the police being able to deploy a drone and chase a criminal who's running from house to house? Absolutely. Now, how do you go and juxtapose the need and the value it can create with the need for personal privacy and protection? And I think this is going to be a consistent fight and maybe not fight. I think that regulators are going to need to become more agile themselves and to be able to work with these technologies in order to come up with models that minimize the potential negative side effects to people and the economy, but maximize the value creation and reduce friction.
Gareth, thank you so much for your insight today. That's Gareth Rees, who's Director of Global Partnerships at IoT.nxt.